The next thing you have is they are very good at innovation. I'll talk a bit about that. They are very close to the customer, but only in the domain where their products are being used. So if they have a long value chain within their customers and there's the product used there, they know more than the customer about that little bit of it, so they can continuously assist the customer to get maximum value out of what they offer. They don't kind of sell remotely. They are in there, and that's part of the services they offer. They have managers who are very good, and generally speaking, the managers coming into these firms has about 10 years experience working in a large multinational. This is Australia's biggest challenge. You don't have those practical schools for managers. Actually, your biggest practical management school in Australia is your automotive supply chain. People who leave companies who live in the Australian automotive supply chain as managers and go in to other firms normally dramatically increase the performance of these other firms because they bring with them a natural way of looking at a high performance firm. That's your best school for generating managers. And actually that's the only one I am worried about if you're going to close down the automotive industry. Right. Then they also know they can't know everything. So one of the things they have to do is to have relationships long-term based on mutual trust with research institutes, be that at universities or CSROs or whatever it is, so that these institutions who keep an eye on what goes on in the field can flag to the firm when something happens that may have a dramatic impact on that firm. So they can say, now you need to understand things about additive manufacturing or 3D printing, or now you need to understand things about this because it will have an impact for you. Because the firm doesn't have the resources to keep their eyes on the breadth, they will keep it on the depth. So they need somebody to help them to de-risk their world. One of the key drivers for these firms is this continued investment in what we call intangibles, R&D, ICT, organization structures, business models, design, brand equity, education and training of staff. And when you look at the investment of tangibles between Australian and Swedish firms, for example, they have the same level of investment in equipment and machinery and stuff like that. There's very little relative difference on that one. The difference sits on the intangible side, where these manufacturing firms invest twice as much in these intangibles as the equivalent Australian firms do. Having gone around in Australian firms, I find you invest enormous, no, I can't say that. I have to say very small amounts, for example, on training your people as average. There are always exceptions, but on average. Very little around that. And also there's some interesting discussions about one of my key things is cost. You still live in the low-cost world. So you say, oh, I need to get rid of my expensive employees and get cheaper ones because then I reduce my cost. That means you haven't thought about the principle of what a skilled employee can bring to you, which an unskilled employee that don't understand your business can't bring. And you lose more on that generally than you gain. And Roy Green has been part of a lot of studies that looked at this management capability, and it is very clear that Australia is a second-tier nation in management capability. There are a number of things underpinning these graphs, but the only thing I want to point out is the total height of the bar indicates best practice in the world. The blue height of the bar indicates where Australia sits. And there is one bar specifically, which here is called instilling a talent mindset, but they all have definitions, which basically closely correlates with your ability to innovate, right? Where you are very poor. And these are average numbers, so there will be firms on all kinds of sides of it. But there is a set of scary statistics. Roughly 1/4 of firms from China and India are substantially better managed than half the Australian firms, roughly. Now, that's one fact. The other fact is that 15% of things manufactured in China are exported. It means 85% is for domestic use. Now, let's make a hypothetical assumption. Let's assume that China get a decline in economic growth. Somewhat, they still grow, but they get a somewhat decline. That means that there will be a decrease in domestic demand. That means that firms will have overcapacity. That means that they will go on the export market. And there is very little shift to make the export market double. Right? And if that means that new firms will enter the export market, that means that half of those will kill, a quarter of those will kill half of Australian firms. Because they are better managed. So it's not only about cost, it's about management capability. So there are some real risks if you remain in that mindset and that way of working. And it requires a different relationship between employer and employee. And here is the unarticulated contract that exists in these countries where I come from. And I've written down here, my responsibility as an employer is to make you, the employee, more employable during your tenure with me. And my responsibility as an employee is to make you, the employer, more successful during my tenure with you. So we both want more firms that are more successful. And then we can disagree what to do with the profit. Right? But that's all right. That's okay. That means that, for 80% of the time in the same room, we agree, and we can be constructive. Which is why the unions and the employers have such a constructive relationship most of the time in these countries. And then they fight it out on the bottom line now and then, but that's fair enough. Right? Say a few words about innovation, because there's something about understanding this concept of integrated innovation. So innovation requires a number of things. Firstly, you need to have a set of enablers. You need to have some money, but that's actually normally not the most important one. The primary important one is competencies and relationships. Then you need to have a strategy around innovation. And that means, and the strategy is very simple, it's kind of half a page long, and it basically articulates the problems that, if solved, would dramatically improve the performance of the firm, but I don't know how to solve them. No? So it's a set of problem statements that are well defined, and they guide our efforts in trying to develop new things. So it's not a random hapstance thing, right? And also, most of these products are systemic, so they're very complex, which means that the creativity is not the critical part, because no one person understands all the bits in these complex things. So it's a group process, not an individual process. Creativity is generally, when we look at how things work in these firms, creativity is seriously overestimated. Yeah, it's a good little thing to have, but it really is not that important. Most of it is managed like a business process. And it works very well, because it needs to deliver continuously on these things. So you have a system to do it. Then when you then innovate, you actually innovate in two dimensions. The first one is you innovate to create value. And this comes natural when people talk about innovation. You use technology, you use design, and I'll talk a little bit about that because that's frequently misunderstood. You used art, and you use another couple of things to create efficiency and create value. But the problem is that if you stop there, then normally the next guy in the value chain will take all your value. So I develop this wonderful new jam, and I go to Coles, and Coles will put the thumb on me and say, you don't get to keep that value, I take it all, right? So what I do is I create value, but I don't keep it. Now, what you have to do is to keep the value you create. And that is around appropriating the value you have created. So that means you need to put equal amount of effort integrated with the other type of innovation around innovating to appropriate value. And that's about two things. One is about effectiveness, in other words, high relevance for the user. That means you need to understand what the user is looking for, right? So you produce wines that the Chinese like and want to drink, rather than wines that the winemaker want to drink. Right? That's a distinction between understanding what is relevance and what is value creation, right? So, and the other one is business models. And a business model is basically a recipe for the firm around how to make money and deploy resources and so forth. But I'll give you an acid test for a good business model, so you can check yourself. A good business model one is where profit, and I'm talking profit as economic profit rather than an accounting term, where economic profit for the firm exceeds the revenue it gets from its primary offering. Right? That's a good business model. So if your profit is lower than your revenue stream from your primary offering, you don't have a good business model. Talk a bit about this. Just to illustrate the difference. There was a couple of studies made. There is a presentation in 2011 here in Australia, draws on a study, and there is a paper in 2009, draws on a study in Scandinavia. And the question basically was around these things. How many of you firms, how many of you guys actually brought to market something that's new to the industry, new to the country, new to the world, something like that? Put it together. The respondent in Australia basically is 12%. The respondent in the Nordic region, the Scandinavian countries, is 89%.